Illinois election laws are in the center of attention this week as the Trump administration wants access to all data in the statewide voter registration list. One Illinois congressman's lawsuit against the State Board of Elections is headed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and yet another congressman says he'll retire at the end of this term. Not the kind of news you'd normally expect in the summer of an odd-numbered year. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, August 1st, 2025. I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capital Cast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. Joining me this week are my colleagues Ben Szalinski and from our Chicago Bureau, Andrew Adams. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Hey, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
So on Monday of this week, the State Board of Elections received a letter from the Justice Department in Washington asking it to hand over the entire unredacted statewide voter registration database. This would include all of the data fields, like on an Excel spreadsheet. That includes your driver's license numbers, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, everything. At the same time, DOJ is weighing in on a lawsuit filed by the conservative activist group Judicial Watch that alleges Illinois is not doing enough to maintain its voter registration rolls. This follows a similar pattern that's apparently playing out in about a dozen other states. Maine and Michigan were in the news just recently over the same issues. So what is the DOJ up to, and why should people be concerned? I spoke earlier this week with David Becker. He is a former Justice Department lawyer who worked in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division at DOJ. He now runs the Center for Election Integrity and Research, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that does election research and advises local election officials around the country. He's also very open with the media and talks about election issues with all news media, large and small. He did a briefing after our story earlier this week about Illinois came out, and here's part of what he had to say when we asked him why people need to be concerned about this.
It's one of the reasons I always point out, this is not about whether documentary proof of citizenship is right or wrong. This is not about whether we have mail ballots that were voted before Election Day should be allowed to be received a few days after the election. And from a Democratic perspective, it's not about whether we have enough early voting or mail voting. This is fundamentally about the power of the executive branch over Congress, the judiciary, the states, and the citizens of those states. And if power is ceded by those states, it can't be taken. The judiciary has been pretty good on that. But if power is ceded by those states, by handing this stuff over now, by ceding to demands of the DOJ that are not supported by federal law, you can be sure that when a president of another party comes into office, that president is going to use that power as well, and you might not be as happy with how that president uses it.
Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. The federal government is asking for the entire voter registration database from Illinois and apparently multiple other states. Ben, start with you first. What do you think are the chances that Illinois actually will hand this information over short of being ordered to by a court?
Basically zero. I think Illinois doesn't like to, just do anything that the Trump administration just demands of them, especially if they think there's potential legal violations there. So I think it'll be interesting to watch, just given why the Trump administration wants this data, and Illinois being a blue state, that has never supported President Trump in any elections, and sometimes we've seen that the president has taken adverse actions against states that did not support him in the Electoral College when he has run for president. So I don't think the odds of any of this data getting handed over willingly are very high. But there certainly could be an order or something else that does force the state to eventually have to turn something over.
Andrew, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, we've never seen anything like this before from the federal government. This is going into uncharted waters here. What do you think is the likely result of all this?
I think my initial reaction is it raises some questions for me about data privacy because there's been a lot of concern about who has access to government data, both at the state and federal level for years. So centralizing so much sensitive personal data could result in some serious concerns on that front.
You know, it was just a few years ago, I think it was right after or in the middle of the 2016 elections, the Illinois databases apparently were hacked, or there was an attempt to hack them from operatives in Russia at the time. And I believe the state has spent a considerable amount of money trying to patch holes and seal it up to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Since then, I mean, haven't state officials been really pretty wary about data leaks and who has access to what on their computer files?
Absolutely. The state has been incredibly concerned with data security around election information, particularly since that leak, which was about, or that hack, which was about 10-ish years ago. And they've spent a lot of money. They've built up offices, both at the state level and in county offices that maintain kind of the local version of these files. So they've been very concerned. I would be shocked if they were not insistent on reviewing how the feds are handling this information, because you let that, basically a spreadsheet, you let that spreadsheet into the wrong email inbox, you let it into on the wrong machine, and it could be the target of foreign actors.
Okay. Well, on the subject of elections, one of Illinois' members of Congress, Congressman Mike Bost from Southern Illinois, has an ongoing lawsuit against the Illinois State Board of Elections, this having to do with counting ballots that come in after the polls have closed, mail-in ballots. This week, more than a dozen national organizations filed amicus briefs in this case. It's about to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, urging the justices to let Congressman Bost have his day in court. And this included groups on the right, on the left, and in the center. Ben, you have written about this lawsuit in the past. Catch us up. What is the issue that the Supreme Court has agreed to decide here?
Yeah, so first off, Mike Bost and this conservative legal group, Judicial Watch, have filed a lawsuit basically challenging Illinois' ability to count mail-in ballots after Election Day. And what they're arguing is that states shouldn't be able to count ballots beyond Election Day because Election Day is one single day established in federal law, and not a series of days where the outcome of the election could be determined 2 weeks later based on how many votes have come in late. So Illinois law, of course, allows ballots that are postmarked by Election Day to be received up to 14 days after the election and still counted. But Mike Bost is basically arguing that basically falls foul of federal election law establishing one single election day, and he wants vote counts to stop being counted right there on Election Day. So his case has fallen short at both the initial circuit court and appellate court levels because judges have ruled that Mike Bost actually doesn't have standing to sue over this issue in his capacity as a federal candidate. So the question that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be reviewing at some point later this year or next spring will be, can Mike Bost, as a federal candidate, have standing to sue over this issue? So it's very important, I think, to note that the U.S. Supreme Court is not going to rule on the validity of Illinois' vote-by-mail law. Rather, it's just going to decide if Mike Bost is even allowed to proceed with his case at a lower court. So a favorable ruling for Mike Bost would go all the way back to a lower court ruling, which would then be forced to make a decision about the validity of Illinois' law.
So it's a very narrow question, as you said, whether or not a sitting member of Congress has standing to sue. And I think some of the lower court judges have said, look, you won your election with more than 75% of the vote. You clearly have not been injured by this law. And so on that basis, they're saying he doesn't have standing to sue. Why are so many national organizations, and we're talking about the American Civil Liberties Union, the League of Women Voters, Judicial Watch, all kinds of right-wing or conservative groups, many of which are aligned with President Trump, are all saying, they're on the same side saying, yes, open this up, let Mike Bost have his day in court. What seems to be up with that? Why so much interest in such a narrow question?
Yeah, I even saw a brief filed by the president's administration, the Department of Justice, even
DOJ is in there, yeah.
Mike Bost. So it's really interesting to note, and I think it's because the underlying issue in this case could actually have massive implications for our election process throughout the country. It's not just about Illinois. It's about this kind of desire to limit vote by mail that the Republican Party and President Trump very specifically have kind of waged the last few years. So I think they're really hoping, by weighing into this case now in favor of Mike Bost, that it's going to be able to go back to that lower court and get that actual ruling on whether the state is able to continue counting ballots that arrive after Election Day. So I think it's really the underlying issue is what's driving all this attention. People want to see that question addressed. And, I don't think that, this case necessarily is the most interesting case in the world at the Supreme Court level, but it certainly would be very interesting if this does get sent back to the lower courts. And that's where all the interest is lying, because a lot of people, agree with Mike Bost on this issue, obviously on the Republican side of the aisle. So they're really hoping that he's going to get a favorable ruling here and will continue to get favorable rulings if it goes back to that lower court.
Okay. And it's interesting to me that one of the things that we often see on election nights as results are coming in, it's often been called the blue shift. And the theory is that Republicans vote in person on Election Day, Democrats vote by mail. And so as you're watching the votes being tallied on election night, the first things you'll see are the votes being counted at the polling place. And then it sometimes takes hours, maybe even days, many days, to count all of the mail-in ballots that are coming in from soldiers overseas, as well as just ordinary citizens who voted by mail rather than showing up in person. Those tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic. And so on election night, you'll see that a Republican is ahead in one state by a large margin. And then as they count the ballots coming in by mail, there's this blue shift, and it becomes much closer, and Democrats will take over. So Republicans have become very critical of this process, thinking that, if you just stop counting the ballots after the ballots that come in after the polls close, then Republicans would fare much better. Remind us a little bit, who are we talking about here? What kinds of ballots would get filtered out if we stopped counting ballots that are postmarked before polls close but don't come in for a day or two or three later?
Yeah, really anyone who filed a ballot kind of late in the game. Maybe they filled out their ballot on Tuesday on Election Day, put it in the mailbox on Tuesday, it got postmarked by Election Day, so it's allowed to be counted. But we know that's not going to arrive at the county clerk's office until, maybe a few days from now. The mail's kind of slow in this country. It's not just here in Illinois, but, it takes 3, 4, 5, sometimes a week for a ballot or any sort of mail to get to its destination, even if it's, the next town over where the county clerk's office is. So I think it would be a pretty wide range of people that would be affected by that decision. People would certainly have to make a much more conscious effort to actually make sure that they have decided who they're voting for, fill out that ballot and get it in the mail probably, a week before Election Day to make sure that their ballot is being counted. It affects both parties. Both parties do vote by mail, even though we do see that, Democrats do vote by mail in much larger numbers. So I don't know it would affect the results of any election because, this kind of people's personal preference on voting, but I think it would probably have to change a lot of voter habits if ballots had to be counted on election day and couldn't be counted in the days after, because the mail is just slow around here sometimes.
Okay. So a third election-related story that was in the news this week. Congressman Danny Davis from the west side of Chicago announced that he will not seek another term in office when his term expires this year. Congressman Davis is, I believe, 83 years old. That makes him part of the same generation as U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, who also announced this year that he is retiring. Andrew Adams, you're up there in the Chicago area. For those of us downstate who are maybe not as familiar with Congressman Davis, tell us a little bit more about him and maybe some of his more colorful history.
Absolutely. Danny Davis is a fixture of Chicago politics. He's been in Congress since 97. He won election in 1996, and he was on city council before that and other kind of official positions since the 1970s. So he's been involved for a very long time. And over that time, he has been fairly well liked by his constituents who continually reelect him, usually with very wide margins. He's a popular figure in his district. But like you said, he has a history of some colorful associations, which started early in, I think, his first campaign. He accepted an endorsement from a spokesperson for Larry Hoover, the noted and currently imprisoned leader of the Gangster Disciples, a noteworthy gang in Chicago. And since then, he's had associations with Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam, a controversial religious group, and once crowned the leader of the Unification Church, Sun Myung Moon, another controversial religious group, once literally crowned this man in a federal office building. So he's an odd character at times, but he has delivered lots of things for his district. He was pretty instrumental in getting federal funding for the Illinois Medical District, which is, a huge part of the near west side. It's massively important for that local economy. So he's leaving a long and colorful history when he leaves office.
So whenever any congressman steps down, it opens up an office, and all kinds of people in lower offices start looking for an opportunity to move up. He has already endorsed somebody to take his place. Who has he endorsed?
Yes, he endorsed LaShawn Ford when he made his announcement that he's retiring. Ford is a state representative from the West Side, has been in the General Assembly for a number of years. He's been reelected several times and is fairly popular, but he's almost certain to face some steep competition. Several other kind of Cook County level politicians already are in the race. And 2 years ago, Danny Davis faced a 5-way primary, which included some noteworthy names. So it's unlikely that race is settled with this Ford endorsement. It'll be very tight. It'll be very heated. I can almost guarantee it.
Okay, and so Ben, this is not the only member of Congress who has decided to step down. There's going to be a lot of change in Illinois' congressional delegation after the next election. Why don't you catch us up on some of the other action that's going on there?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy that 4 of Illinois' 17 members of the U.S. House are leaving or going to be out of their current job, and then you add in Dick Durbin, so that makes 5 of the 19 people who represent Illinois changing hands here. So obviously we'll have Dick Durbin leaving office in 2027, which has caused 2 other current members of the U.S. House, Raja Krishnamurthy and Robin Kelly, to decide to give up their seats in the House to try and pursue that Senate seat.
Along with Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a major shakeup, certainly in Democrat politics, but that leaves two more open seats in Congress that need to be filled down in Robin Kelly's district, which goes all the way from Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood way down to Danville. It's one of the longest and largest districts in the state. There's quite a few people who are going for that seat. Robert Peters, I think, is the most notable candidate currently in the race. He's state senator from the south side of Chicago. He's certainly gathering up a lot of support, but we're also watching for Jesse Jackson, the former congressman who represented that district, to come and try and take his seat back. He, as a lot of people will remember, went to federal prison. And he is still eligible to run for office, and he's certainly weighing it. It looks like right now his campaign has put out some polls that show he's very popular and would potentially win this primary. We'll see how voters receive him. But then up in Raja Krishnamurthy's district, which is the northwest suburbs of Chicago, not quite the most interesting race up there. It's kind of been pretty tame, but it's going to be just another new member of Congress to represent the suburbs. And the race that I think is really going to be the most interesting in this cycle, maybe, competing a little bit with this race for Danny Davis's seat, is the 9th congressional district, which is currently represented by Jan Schakowsky, who is also in that same age group. She's about 80 years old. So she's part of this, group who's leaving office here, basically. So she's decided to give up her seat, which includes a district that is one of the other crazier districts in the state. It goes from basically Wrigley Field on the north side of Chicago all the way up to Crystal Lake in McHenry County, includes Evanston, Skokie, some random parts of Lake in northern Cook County. So that has generated this massive primary election here, with Evanston Mayor Daniel Biss is one of the clear frontrunners in this race. State Senator Laura Fine is in this race. There's a progressive social media influencer, Kat Abou-Ghazaleh, who's also in this race. Mike Simmons, another state senator, is in this race. Han Nguyen, a state representative, is in this race. I mean, the list is very long. I think we're up to 10 candidates or so there. So I think, this is just a generational shift in Illinois politics, because not only is it shaking up our congressional delegation, as you've heard by some of these names I've mentioned, it's going to be shaking up Springfield as well. There's going to be a lot of new state lawmakers who are going to be coming into the General Assembly beginning in 2027, just because so many of them have decided to give up their current seat and run for a congressional seat. So this is certainly probably one of the most important elections, at least on the Democrat side of the aisle, in a very long time in Illinois politics.
Okay, so another big story this week that we don't often hear about has to do with insurance premiums. We don't normally hear about election stories in the summer of odd-numbered years, and we very rarely hear politicians make a whole lot of noise about insurance premiums. During the legislative session, Secretary of State Alexi Giannoulias and several other lawmakers introduced legislation to put some curbs on automobile insurance, and specifically to try to prevent them from using information unrelated to a person's driving record, such as their credit history, to set their insurance premiums. That bill did not pass. Giannoulias is still pushing for that. He held a news conference earlier this week to talk about his continued push for reforming the way automobile insurance rates are set. Let's listen to a little bit of what he had to say.
The horrible, hard truth is that car insurance companies charge you more for auto insurance based on your credit rating, the neighborhood you live in, and your age. And it really doesn't matter that you're a safe driver. Policies based on credit rating and zip code disproportionately impact people with lower incomes and people of color. In fact, an Illinois driver with good credit and a DUI will get a lower premium than a driver with poor credit and no DUI.
Okay, so he's going after automobile insurance premiums. This came on the heels of two Democratic leaders in the General Assembly penning an op-ed piece that appeared in the Chicago Tribune, where they were taking on State Farm Insurance Company for raising homeowners insurance rates. Ben, why the sudden interest in the cost of insurance premiums in Illinois?
Yeah, I think it was really driven by that decision by State Farm to raise homeowners insurance premiums in the state by 27%. Alexei Janulius and other lawmakers have had that bill, to curb what kind of factors can be included in car insurance premiums. That bill's been in the General Assembly for a few years and been unsuccessful so far. But I think really what he's trying to do, as well as the governor and Senate president and speaker, they're trying to capitalize on a lot of consumer frustration with rising costs. Everybody, I think, in this state and around this country is frustrated over costs just continue to go up. And, State Farm homeowners insurance customers here in Illinois are going to be faced with a pretty sizable increase that began back in July here. So I think it's kind of, an issue where Democrats are, in a way, identifying a way that they think they might be able to make a difference. They're saying that on the State Farm side, that State Farm is not being transparent about why they're raising their rates. State Farm is saying that it's because of weather. They said Illinois has the second highest rate of hail damage in the country. They've provided that data pretty publicly, but the governor is alleging that State Farm is really just trying to make up for their losses in other states. California with endless wildfires. Florida's been hit by a number of hurricanes in recent years, and they've had some very substantial costs and losses there. Essentially what the governor and a lot of Democrats are saying is that State Farm has not been transparent with the State Department of Insurance, and they want to impose some new regulations on insurance companies that they're going to have to be more transparent with data, provide more data up front about why they're increasing rates on Illinoisans. And they want to give the department more of a say in approving or denying rate increases. We've seen that stuff on the energy front. So they're looking, I think, to kind of transfer some of that model from the Illinois Commerce Commission into some sort of insurance model there. And I think Alexei Janulius is, a well-timed campaign on his own end. He's creating this new campaign with town halls and a website where consumers are going to be able to weigh in about their stories of alleged insurance discrimination, ways they think that their car insurance company has, provided them unfair rates for whatever reason. So it's an interesting way, I think, that Democrats are getting attention and hopefully getting some support from voters on it, I think, is their goal here. So we'll see if it makes its way into a more comprehensive legislative package. But the governor has said this certainly could be a veto session issue, at least on the insurance regulation front as far as homeowners insurance goes.
Well, you mentioned the wildfires in California, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast and the Southeast, natural disasters that have happened all over the country. Andrew, I wanted to ask you, first of all, insurance rates are going up nationwide. We've heard this in multiple states. Is this simply the price that we're paying for climate change? And is there any evidence that Illinois is actually being taxed, so to speak, by insurance companies to subsidize rates in California and Mississippi and Florida, South Carolina?
The overall trend that insurance rates for homeowner insurance are going up, that's definitely just a climate change consequence, right? There are more storms that are more damaging more often. This is true across the board. You really can't get around that in any state, although some states are more exposed than others. Florida, for example, is notoriously bad. There are parts of coastal Florida where insurance companies just won't insure a home. It would be cheaper to rebuild it from scratch than insure it. And even when you can get insurance, it's often an order of magnitude more expensive than insurance is in Illinois, for example. So there's definitely that at play. And even in Illinois, we do have more extreme hail. We do have more extreme storms, although certainly not as bad as California or Louisiana with hurricanes or question of, are we being taxed for those other states with more extreme weather? That's something that really only the insurance companies can answer, because they're very protective and very secretive over the math that they do to calculate premiums, since that's their entire business. Although I will say that the governor has said that the Department of Insurance, which does have access to some of those numbers, did calculate it, and they got a different figure than what State Farm claims that they're spending on payouts. So that's kind of the governor's accusation right now, is that we are being taxed, but really it would require some very firm regulation to be able to say that definitively one way or the other.
Okay, and finally this week, I did want to touch on a couple of late-breaking stories that happened on Friday. Ben, we'll start with you. Attorney General Kwame Raoul has joined yet another multi-state lawsuit, this one challenging... well, why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, this is a lawsuit that is challenging an executive order that the president issued very early within, I think, his first week as president back in January, that basically prevents any federally funded healthcare facility, which is a whole lot of facilities in the United States that get federal grant funding, from providing gender-affirming care to people under age 19. It's an interesting number because Illinois considers 18-year-olds to be adults, but essentially the goal here of the president is to ban any sort of transgender surgery, something like that, from happening to children. And the attorney general is arguing that this is an unconstitutional order because the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution gives states the right to regulate healthcare. So this is just another issue, I think, in several dozen lawsuits I think Illinois is engaged in, suing the Trump administration over various executive orders, various policies. The California Attorney General at the news conference today said his state is up to 37 lawsuits. I don't think Illinois is quite that high, but it's another example of a pretty clear trend that we're seeing and we'll probably continue to see for the next 3.5 years of Trump's presidency, where the state of Illinois is going to find all avenues to challenge any executive orders. I think it's kind of noteworthy that it's been about, 6 months that President Trump has been in office. Took the state and these states about 6 months to get together and file this lawsuit on an action he took within his first week. So they're clearly taking their time, reviewing all the legal options that they have against pretty much everything it seems that the president is doing on the executive front.
Okay, and then Andrew, you were out earlier this Friday morning at Wrigley Field at a time when there was not a ball game going on. Tell us why Wrigley Field is in the news.
Yeah, officially the announcement has been made. The Chicago Cubs will host the All-Star Game in 2027. Big day for Cubs fans, which include a lot of elected officials in this state. It's interesting because, one, this field has been undergoing renovation for like a decade, mostly in order to make their bid for a fourth All-Star Game. So it's the culmination of a lot of effort from the Ricketts family that owns the Cubs and the city and to some extent the state. It's also interesting because whether or not the 2027 season happens is a little bit up in the air. There's an expiring labor contract between players and owners that is almost certainly going to cause a fight. So very exciting day for Cubs fans, but we'll see if it gets a little less exciting at the end of 2026.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.